Welcome to another episode of the amazing food and drink behind the scenes series. Today we're in County Down at the luxurious Hinch Distillery.
Hi everyone, you're very welcome today to Hinch Distillery. My name is Patrick Cross, I'm one of the directors here. We first got into the drinks industry 21 years ago with our Chateau de la Ligne in Bordeaux, which sells wine all over the world. Here at Hinch, we're super passionate about food and drink and developing tourism within Northern Ireland. Today we're going to take a walk around the distillery and we're going to focus on our whiskies and our 9th wave Irish gin.
My name's Claire and I'm one of the tour guides here at Hinch Distillery, home to 9th wave Irish gin and 9th wave Irish export strength. Presently the world's most awarded gin, and it's taking the market by storm. But gin, my friends, what has to be in place for it to be called gin? It has to be predominantly flavoured with juniper. And juniper is something that grows in Ireland, it grows all the way across Europe, and versions of gin have been made for hundreds of years. Now, the very first version would have been in the Middle Ages, and it was created by Christian monks. And can I just say, Christian monks have an awful lot to answer for. Pretty much all the alcohol we drink nowadays was invented by them, albeit medicinally, and these alcohols were strong. They became known as spirits, and there's no coincidence in that. But the monks were creating an alcohol predominantly flavoured with juniper to treat the plague. And the plague would have been sweeping Europe at the time, and this was a version of gin that you didn't just drink, that you also bathed in. And the monks weren't far from the money, because juniper is actually a natural flea repellent, and it worked quite well, in fact. But juniper and gin would change many times over before it would arrive in our shores officially. And it would arrive here in the late 1600s in the hands of Dutch soldiers. And these Dutch soldiers were drinking Genever, their national drink before warfare. And this drink was giving them stamina and tenacity in battle, and it became known by their opposition as Dutch courage. So gin was the original, it's where the expression came from. And the leader of these troops, well, the Dutch leader would marry into the royal family on his success, and this is King William of Orange that we're talking about. And he was bringing his version of gin, which was called Genever, translating to juniper, to our shores to be drunk originally by the aristocracy. But it was expensive and popular, and people started to make their own gin. And by 1725, a gin craze had started, with over 6,000 legal vendors in London alone, and 1 in 4 households creating their own in their bathtubs. But this illegal gin was a different beast. It was highly addictive, it was blue and cloudy, it could make you go blind. If it didn't kill you, you were lucky. But what this illegal gin did do was cure the pain and hunger of the cold, and well, it also masked the unpleasantness of life. But this illegal gin would get its hold on society. It became known as a luxury of the vulgar and a scourge, to say the least. And by 1736, taxes were put in place to try and curb the production, but all that did was curb the production of the legal gin. The illegal gin, it continued in popularity. But it had taken on a new name. It would now be known as Old Tom or Madame Geneva, a way to stop the authorities finding out where it was being stored. And by 1751, a gin panic was now taking place. This gin was making strong men weak and making women lose their moral standards, and the women were drinking it side by side with the men and drinking it by the pint. So yeah, a very different view on gin was now being taken, and it would fall out of popularity. For the next 100 years or so, well, gin would be looked at with disdain, but it gave the distillers a chance to recreate, to rebrand the product. And now adding more ingredients, they didn't just go with juniper, they added in coriander, and they also added in angelica. Now, coriander is lemony and earthy in flavour, and angelica, it anaesthetises your tongue when you chew it. And this new recipe would be rebranded London Dry Gin, fine and upstanding. And when you have something fine and upstanding, you need somewhere equally so to drink it in. And now we would see Gin Palaces open. Gin Palaces, well, our original sits in Belfast City Centre, presently owned by the National Trust. It's the Crown Bar as we would know it. And when you step into the Crown Bar, you see velvet, you see gold leaf and mahogany, and all of these are opulent finishings and fixtures to attract a higher class of customer, obviously. And the Gin Palaces would certainly do that. Traders from the East India Trading Company would be visiting regularly. They were the ones bringing back these exotic spices and of course the tea that was now gaining popularity alongside it. And these guys were taking gin with them on their travels and adding gin into quinine heavy Indian tonic water. This became a very effective anti-malarial medication and would see the popularity of gin and tonic increase. And the officers in the Navy, they didn't want rum anymore, they wanted gin. And gin would settle your stomach if you were on a rough sea, especially if you added Angostura bitters into it. And the Angostura bitters would turn the gin pink and tart in flavour. We have pink gin and the birth of that popular trend too. And at sea, adding lime to your gin would obviously prevent scurvy, but also this lime and gin would become one of the most popular cocktails in the Roaring 20s, and it would become known as a gimlet. So that's a little bit of backstory about gin's history, my friends. But have all of you tried Ninth Wave? Ninth Wave has 9 botanicals in it. On top of our holy trinity, the juniper, the coriander, the angelica, we go with spice. We have cassia, which smells a little bit like cinnamon. We have cardamom, which is aromatic and spicy. And then we have grains of paradise, which effectively have a flavour profile like black pepper. And then for the citrus elements, there is lemon peel and lemon verbena, and finally orris root. Orris root has the flavour of a bitter nut, but both orris and angelica have the effect of salt on your gin. Now they don't taste like salt, but they act in the same way. They combine the flavours, they fix them together, and they push those flavours forward within your gin. Ninth Wave, 9 botanicals, gets its name from the ninth wave. In Celtic mythology, the largest wave out at a high sea. And if this wave was to engulf you, well, you would go to the other world, like Celtic heaven, where happiness and laughter was prevalent. And well, if you survived that wave, you were seen as nigh on indestructible. So either way, it was a win-win. So that's our Ninth Wave gin and the 9 botanicals in it. Into the distillery, this is our gin still that we've named David, and all of the gin, the Ninth Wave Irish gin we create, will come from him. And in making gin, you start off with an alcohol that sits at 96% ABV, and it's known as grain neutral spirit. Now at 96%, that strength, if you put your botanicals in on top, they would actually get chemically burned. So our distillers need to cut this alcohol down to about 46% ABV, and they do that with Silent Valley water. Now at 46%, in goes the botanicals, and this alcohol in the still is going to be brought to the boil. And distillation, by its definition, is the separation of liquids through their boiling point, and alcohol comes to the boil before water does. Now as the alcohol is coming to the boil, it's going to turn into a gas form. It's going to carry with it all those beautiful essential oils that come out of the botanicals. And that gas is going to rise up across the silver line and down into the second vessel in the middle, and it's known as a vapour basket. The vapour basket in the middle is for delicate botanicals, things like the lemon verbena, leaves that will stick to the side and maybe get burnt otherwise. So wrapping those in a muslin cloth and putting them into the vapour basket, it means those beautiful alcoholic gases can pass through them and pick up their essential oils too. That heavily flavoured alcoholic gas will now rise up once more and go across down into the condensing tank at the side. And inside that tank, there are chilled, smaller tubes. And when the hot alcoholic gases hit those cool tubes, they then turn back into liquid form again. And that is your gin that is now running down to be collected. But the first about 15 litres of that will not be gins that you want to drink. They're not going to have a good flavour profile. And a way that our distillers can actually monitor that is by looking at the gin fountain at the side. Now this is a gin fountain, my friends, and quite frankly, I think all of us would like one of those in our house, but it's a way for our distillers to monitor. After that first 15 litres has passed through, the next gin that comes is going to be that is bottled. And each batch that we make, you're making about 850 bottles, of gin that we will then have to go out onto our shelves in the future. So that, my friends, is how gin is made. For our gin school experience, you're going to make your own gin by using pre-flavoured distillates that our distillers have made, going through the same process, but only using one botanical at a time. And we have them stored here in our cupboard. And this, my friends, is like an apothecary from Harry Potter or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Within, we have the different botanicals in their raw form that you can come up and have a smell of. We have our little beakers of distillates that you will be using to measure into your own gin. And then we have these. These are amazing. They're little atomizers full of distillate, and with one press of a button, you can get a flume to get your nose into. Absolutely delightful. With all these beautiful distillates, ultimately what you end up with is 500 ml of your own personalised gin. You'll get your name on the label, a little bit of fun written on the side, and your little seal shut. Now, folks, if this sounds like something you want to do, you can book our gin schools that run on a Thursday, Friday and Saturday night through our website. And when you go online, you can see the spaces that are available and the options that you have to take. So I'll be looking forward to seeing you. Come on in and have a great evening at Hinch Distillery's Gin School.
So in terms of Hinch Distillery itself, it was first started by Dr. Terry Cross back in November 2020, and then it was built on the site of his home here on Killaney Estate. The estate itself was built by the 4th Marquess of Downshire back in 1849, and then 161 years later, Hinch came onto the land, and it takes its name from the neighbouring town of Ballynahinch, meaning town of the island. So in terms of Irish whiskey, it's generally thought around the year 1000 AD, Irish monks brought the technique of distilling perfume back from the Mediterranean and Southern Europe, and then a few centuries later they had tweaked the recipe to a level where you could drink the final spirit. Thanks be to God. Quite literally, because they thought it was divine. Over the years, Irish whiskey typically would have been double distilled and it would have been peated, so it would be quite close to what we would now know as a Scotch. Then the taste began to change around the early 1900s. With the Industrial Revolution and the expansion of the railways, coal became the main fuel source on the island of Ireland, and so peated whiskey really fell by the wayside here. It stuck around in the Highlands of Scotland, which was untouched by that industrial expansion, but that was pretty much the split in taste at that point in time. So we're what's known as a malt distillery, and that means we use primarily malted barley as our main grain. You can make whiskey from lots of different types of grains, but barley's our go-to. The first jar we have here is green barley, and this is what barley's like when it's taken out of the field from harvest. It's quite hard and unpalatable, there's a bit of a sharp, bitter taste to it, and if you were to bite into it, you might chip a tooth. But you still can make whiskey from green barley, although it's more closely associated with poaching, which we'll talk about a wee bit further on. Our second jar here is malted barley. So in order to malt it, we take huge quantities of the green barley and soak it in steeping vessels for 2 to 3 days. After it's absorbed all that moisture, the barley will be emptied out onto the floor of a malt house. And here it'll be forked and aerated, and what we're doing here is encouraging germination. It's essentially a bit of biological trickery, making this seed believe it's springtime by applying heat and moisture. This is then going to release enzymes that break the hard starches down into sugar. In nature, that sugar would be used as energy to send out shoots, roots, and a whole new plant to start the life cycle again. But what we're going to do is take that sugar and turn it into alcohol. If we let that germination continue, it will. So after about 5 days, the barley is finally taken and put into a kiln where it's heated between 60 to 80 degrees. And after that, we have malted barley. Our third jar further down is peated malted barley. So the same process is followed, but when we get to the kiln, we use a peat or a turf smoked fire, and the flavour through the smoke locks into the grain and comes out in the taste of the final whisky. The final jar, as you can see, is very different. This is corn, literally just popcorn. Maize will be used quite commonly for whisky production across America and Europe. Bourbon, for example, to be called a bourbon, it has to be at least 51% corn. And although we don't use any corn in our whisky production here at Hinch, bourbon plays a huge part in how Irish whisky is matured. The vast majority will be cast in ex-bourbon barrels. And again, there's a few historical reasons behind that, which we'll chat about further on. So now we have our malted barley. It's sitting packed full of sugar ready to go. But if you think about a cup of coffee, for example, you don't put the bean into the cup whole, you grind it up and break it down so you can extract the most flavour. Same thing's done here. This is an old style mill, how it would have been done on a small scale back in the day. It's now obviously done on a much bigger industrial scale, but by grinding up our malted barley, it leaves us with this coarse flour that the distillers call grist. And what we've done here is just made the sugar easier for us to extract. Obviously this is still a solid, we're looking at liquid as our final product. So we need to add a wee drop of water. And the actual word whiskey comes from the Irish ishcabaha, which means water of life, or in Latin, aqua vita. So what we've made here is what the distillers call mash, and it's your raw materials for the start of whiskey production. We're allowing the sugar to dissolve up into the hot water. We then strain off the hard material and move this liquid forward, adding something else to turn it into something that we can drink. Because what we've made here at the minute is essentially a bowl of hot, sweet porridge. If I handed this at the end of the tour, there wouldn't be too much crack. So we're going to head upstairs into the mash house, and that'll show us how we make all of this on an industrial scale. So in here then folks, this is the mash house, and this is where we make what I had showed you downstairs on an industrial scale. We're what's known as a 1 ton distillery, meaning for every batch of mash we make, we use 1 ton of grain. And that will come in milled and malted through this green arm into our first vessel called the mash tun, or the mash conversion tank. With it, we add 4,000 litres of hot water, and it'll come in at about 68 degrees. A large arm at the bottom of this drum will rotate round and allow all that sugar to dissolve up into the liquid, and that will go for about 30 minutes. After that, everything's transferred into our second, slightly larger vessel. This is called the larder tun. With it, we add another 4,000 litres of hot water, and it'll be pumped in much slower. That's just to rinse any of the residual sugar that's clung to the side of the grain. Then the husk will separate, so the outer shell falls apart and sinks down to the bottom, forming a thick natural bed, pretty much like a sieve. And that allows the distillers to strain off all that sweet liquid separately. With evaporation, we now have about 5,000 litres of this sweet, sugary liquid called wort. But this wort still contains no alcohol. That's where these vessels come into play. What we can see here is just the tip of the iceberg. These go right down to the ground floor, and they hold 14,000 litres each. These are called washbacks in the industry, or their technical name is fermentation tanks. So we take 2 lots of wort and top up one of the washbacks, and then add the magic ingredient, which is yeast. And yeast is a real sugar-hungry molecule. It's going to latch on to any glucose in that liquid and transform it into things like carbon dioxide and, most importantly, alcohol. These will ferment for anywhere between 3 to 5 days, depending on the flavour the brewers want to go for. And at the end of that, we have an alcohol strength of about 8%. So what we've made here is essentially a high-strength beer. With these vessels, I would open them up to let you have a smell. If anyone's ever worked in a bar, it has a bit of that stale alcohol flavour, smells a bit like a bucket of slops the morning after. But when you open these vessels, the first thing to fly out is all the carbon dioxide. The blue light starts flashing and everybody gets a bit of a light head before you've even had a drink. So we try to keep them closed. So folks, over here is pretty much natural biology. We're encouraging starch to turn into sugar, to turn into alcohol. Over here is pure chemistry, and this is our beautiful chemistry set are 3 copper pot stills. Our stills here at Hinch are named after 3 of the Mourne Mountains in County Down. Our first one is called Donard, after Slieve Donard, the highest peak in Northern Ireland and our largest still, holding 10,000 litres. After it we have Crúb, named after Slieve Crúb, the source of the River Lagan. Here at Hinch, Crúb's the source of our spirit. And last but not least, we have Binion, named after Wee Binion that overlooks the Silent Valley where we draw our water from. Here, Binion oversees our final spirit. The process of distillation then. We take our 10,000 litres of 8% wash and it's pumped into the bottom of Donard, and then we turn up the heat. Alcohol will evaporate faster than water. So at about 92 degrees, everything begins to boil and the gases start to rise up across that large bulb and along the angular line arm. As the gas comes into contact with the copper, this is known as reflux, and it's stripping out the sulphur and adding in a few esters and flavours that we'll taste after. Everything then gathers to the top of this large column, and inside it are a lot of smaller copper tubes which are flushed with cold water. This then causes another chemical shock and the gas turns back into a liquid. Gravity lets it fall down and be collected in the receiving vessel. This will run for about 8 to 10 hours, and at the end of that we have less than half the liquid we started with. We're now down to about 4,000 litres, but our alcohol strength has gone up to about 23%. So this is what the distillers now call low wine. And that low wine is the first stage of our triple distillation. So this is the spirit safe, and it's a bit of a throwback to history, which we'll talk about in a minute. But every drop of spirit that we produce here at Hinch will pass through there at some stage. The 3 fountains and the 5 bowls are connected to the stills behind. The first one you can see has a bit of grist in the fountain and the bowl's quite cloudy compared to the others. That's because Donard pulls everything through in that first round of distillation. Our second fountain here is connected with Crúb and it splits between 2 bowls. And the distillers will now begin to collect what they call the heads, the hearts and the tails. The heads go in the first bowl. They're volatile gases that smell a bit like nail polish remover. They also contain quite a high bit of methanol. If consumed in high enough quantities, methanol can be fatal. Even low doses can cause you to lose your eyesight. And that's where you get the phrase blind drunk. Our hearts now are the prime cut of this distillation, and they'll separate at about 94 degrees. That's all the flavour and the alcohol that we're looking for. After that, we go back to this first bowl to collect the tails. And these are the final gases to run off at about 97 degrees. After that there, our heads and tails will be put back into Crúb, distilled again with the next lot coming through, because there's still alcohol in there. We just need to round off the edges. Our hearts will leave us with about 1,200 litres, sitting at 60% alcohol. So it's now spirit strength. Because we triple distill in the traditional Irish style, everything goes through Binion for a third and final round, leaving us with 800 litres, sitting at 80% alcohol. This 80% is too strong to cask. You're going to lose too much through evaporation, so it'll be cut with water down to about 63%, and then everything's barreled up and sent off for its big fleet. Spirit safes would have came about around the late 1600s. The first whisky tax in 1661 drove many producers underground, and this was furthered by the malt barley tax coming in 1725, which eventually gave way to the birth of poaching. Registered distilleries had to have a spirit safe installed, and a revenue officer would live on site doing random inspections to make sure no one's overproducing. And all these registered distilleries were now making what was known as Parliament whisky. Everyone doing it illegally on the outskirts of the countryside were making it in smaller batches. The word poaching actually comes from the Irish, meaning small pot. So we're going to head round to the Spectrum room and chat a bit about maturation. So in here, folks, this is the Spectrum room, and this is just a nice space to give you an idea of how whisky matures. So everything that we were talking about outside there, that clear liquid that runs out of Binion, it's 80% in alcohol and has a wee bit of flavour, but legally it's what we have to call new make spirit. It isn't whisky just yet. To be known as Irish whisky, it has to be distilled on the island of Ireland, must be cast in an oak barrel, and has to be matured for a minimum of 3 years. Some people like to say 3 years and a day because it sounds more lyrical, but legally speaking, it's 3 years. Bourbon is 1, Scotch is 2, Irish whiskey's 3. So behind us is a wall of new make spirit, and it all looks the same, but depending on how you've treated the barley and the distillation process, you can have different elements of flavour coming through. So in front of us are a few pairs of atomizers, and these turn liquid into gas in front of you. Our first one is filled with new make spirit at about 63%. And if we give the button a click, a plume of smoke pops out, and you can get quite a sweet flavour coming off it. So this hasn't matured and it's only been cut once. Our second one here is filled with peated whiskey. So because we peated the barley, you get that really strong smoky flavour coming off it. It's like you're walking around Ulster Folk and Transport Museum. So that's just a wee demonstration. Don't judge a book by its cover. Our new make spirit, as I say, this is how poaching would have looked as well. Some of you might have heard of the phrase moonshine. Generally, you'd think it's a very American term, but moonshine actually originated in Ireland. During the early 1600s, when poaching distillers were making their whiskey out in the countryside, they would have usually ran the stills at night time, because to have a plume of smoke coming from your house for 10 to 12 hours a day was a bit of a giveaway to any local revenue men or informants. This birthed a whole culture of running the stills in the evening, and the liquid would be produced by the light of the moon or by the moonshine. The name caught on, made its way across the Atlantic, and it stuck around in America a lot longer than it did here. So that's our moonshine over at this side. So over at this side of the room, this is our spectrum wall. George Bernard Shaw said whiskey is liquid sunshine, and it would be hard to argue otherwise looking at this. It's a nice peek at how whiskey matures as time goes on, because usually we only see it in its clear liquid form or in its final golden caramel state. So this is a nice peek at what happens in between. Typically, we'll get what's known as a first fill ex-bourbon. First fill means that our new make spirit is the first liquid to come into contact with this barrel since it's been scourged or emptied of its original bourbon. You can see as time goes on, you get a deeper draw of colour, and that's going to come through in your flavour as well. Here, we're up to about a year. This is roughly 5 years, 10, 15. You can use a barrel up to 4 times. So here we have a second and a third fill ex-bourbon barrel. There's a bit of a misconception around whiskey. Some people think older and bolder has to be better. But if you enjoyed the smell of the first atomizer more than the second, you probably prefer a younger, more delicate floral spirit. So matching that with a more mature cask is going to bring out a gentler flavour note and a softer colour palette. So my rule on it is, drink what you enjoy. Bourbon has to go into a brand new barrel, but you can do the same with whiskey, and this is what's known as a virgin oak. By getting that first contact with the wood, you're making use of all the tannins and flavours available, and you can see immediately you get a much deeper draw of colour coming through, and again, that's going to play out in your palate. Or you can put your whiskey in a different type of cask altogether. So during the years of whiskey smuggling, distillers and smugglers would often transport their whiskey in the wrong type of barrel, a sherry cask or a wine butt, anything that wasn't under the same scrutiny as whiskey for tax purposes. After a few years in these wrong barrels, distillers found it lent a whole different flavour and colour element to their whiskies. So behind us, these have been matured in ex-red wine barrels. The owner of the company, Terry Cross, also has a chateau out in Bordeaux, Chateau de la Ligne, and these are taken from his ex-Grand Reserve Cab Sauves and Merlots. Further down, we have a second and a first fill sherry cask wall. Oloroso sherry gives a lovely spicy cinnamon note. If anyone's ever had a redbreast or a blackbush, this will be up your street. And on the very end here, we have a port cask, bringing out that nice deep ruby hit, and again, bringing a sweeter element into the whiskey. Port and sherry cask would have been much more commonly available across the British Isles during the 17 and 1800s. Reason being, Britain and France were constantly at war with each other, so a secure trade of wine was never guaranteed. Sherry from Spain and port from Portugal, much more readily available over the years. The casks would have been in surplus and the flavours have stood the test of time. So folks, that's just a quick glimpse at what we do here at Hinch Distillery. But there's a lot more to explore, and unfortunately you can't taste the whiskey through a screen. So come on down, give us a visit, and we'll have a wee dram.
Hi Colin, I'm Dr. Terry Cross. I'm the chairman of Hinch Distillery. It came about because I had been in Bordeaux in the wine industry. So we concentrated all our efforts initially in France in the wine in getting the quality right. And we have done that successfully. And of course, planting the vineyard. We planted the vineyard in, when was it, 21 years ago. And that was quite a challenge, you know, because the place looked like a World War I battlefield. We had to eliminate frost pockets and places where it would be dangerous to drive a tractor. So we replanted 11 hectares, say 21 years ago. So I had a bit of money and didn't want to retire. Needed a reason to get out of bed. So I went in, I had partially driven by the difficulties in Bordeaux, but not impossibilities, but difficulties. I read about the fact that Irish whiskey was the fastest growing brown spirit in the world. So I thought, well, it'd be nice to get a bit of action in that, and I can do it without going to China. You know, I can do it locally. In fact, the only place you can make Irish whiskey is in Ireland. So, I mean, here I am. So we initially looked at various sites, actually, probably about 20 in total. And we almost went to County Antrim, and for various reasons didn't, which we don't need to go into. But I thought to myself, you know, I've got 25 acres here. You know, I planted 12,500 trees, you know, as part of the carbon capture. And I've got land. Why not do it here? Because in terms of tourism, between Belfast and the Mountains of Mourne, there's really no reason to stop for a tourist. And if they come here, you know, they're about half an hour away from Belfast, less, and they can do the Mountains of Mourne, Newcastle, and they can squeeze a lot more into their available time. We decided we wanted to have a tourist offering as well, and that's the reason for the brasserie there, for the function room upstairs, this function room, and also the gift shop, and the tours, of course. You know, it's partly driven by tourists. It's essentially driven by the fact that it takes 3 years and 1 day, legally, to make Irish whiskey. What do we do in the meantime for cash flow? We've got exposure in probably 30 overseas markets. Russia's very good for us. The United States is complex but has great potential. China is also great potential. In fact, I met the Germany, of course, as well, and France recently. I met the Chinese consul recently, and she asked me how many bottles of whiskey we were going to make. I said, well, probably about 1.2 million. She said, that's no use. She said, we'll only do one province in China. And she's absolutely right. You know, we forget that China is the most populous country on the planet, a quarter of the world's population in China.
I've known Terry Cross for many years, and when you look around this facility and the employment he's bringing into this area, it's just fabulous. But then Terry was always out for jobs for people of Northern Ireland, and this has been a dream come true for him. And I'm delighted to be here today for another reason. Terry's a big supporter of integrated education, and we have the staff of Integrated down today for their annual lunch. So it was good to come, see it, and see Terry, and support him in all the work he does. You know, sometimes in Northern Ireland we hear a lot of talk about people who create jobs and do this and do that. Terry Cross is one of those quiet people in the background who susses out different things like this and puts it into motion, puts the jobs in, and you never hear him even saying about it. And you know, we need more people like that, more people who can create wealth, because that's the future for Northern Ireland, particularly among young people. And I know Terry's involved in a lot of that work also. So I'm delighted to be here today to support him and to support the Hinch, and I'm looking forward to my lunch.